So, Linda, I have a question about the Whisk 5. If
Yes,
a child measures, let's say, 110 in verbal understanding or comprehension and 141 in the visual spatial range and ends up with a full scale IQ of 100 and, let's say, 104, would you say that child is gifted?
absolutely. There are many reasons why I would say that child is gifted. First of all, that gifted visual spatial learner needs to be recognized and needs to be accepted in the gifted program. We have many, many, many children all over the world who have extraordinary visual spatial abilities, and they're marginalized and not even allowed into gifted programs where we use the full scale IQ score that doesn't take that visual spatial index into account. The visual spatial index was added to both the WISC and the Stanford Binet fifth edition because of the work I had done on visual spatial learners. The test constructors recognize that visual spatial children need to be identified and that there are more and more and more of them all over the world. That's one of the things that I wanted to mention. But there's a second issue, and that has to do with the what we call now in the United States the demise of the full scale IQ score. When I began working in this field, there was only the Stanford Binet intelligence scale, and it had one global score. And that was what we used when we started our center. And then when we switched to the WISC R, that's how long ago it was, that we switched to the WISC R because the Stanford Binet had kind of become an old test that people weren't accepting. We saw big discrepancies between the WISC scores and the Stanford Binet scores. One of the things that would pull down a child's score, especially if they were twice exceptional, is that they had coding, which is eye-hand coordination and speed, included in the full scale IQ score. So that meant that all children who had eye-hand coordination problems, all children who were reflective thinkers, all children who had a processing speed issue were being penalized by the full scale IQ score. When I first started using Wechsler scales, there was a verbal, a performance, and a full scale IQ score. And the way the full scale IQ score was weighted, verbal had a higher weight than performance. When the WISC 3 came out, there were now 4 different variables that were being assessed, 4 factors that led to the full scale IQ score. And there were 4 factors in the WISC 4. When the WISC 5 came out, there were now 5 factors. Every factor that we add decreases the unitary construct of a full scale IQ score. By the time we got to 5 factors, we were either expecting gifted children to be good at working memory, fluid reasoning, visual spatial reasoning, verbal reasoning, processing speed, or we had to recognize that we were getting such discrepant scores among these variables that we could not any longer rely on the full scale IQ score as the measure that should be used. We had discovered this with the WISC 4. We wrote many papers and gave many presentations at the National Association for Gifted Children conference in the United States. And eventually, the NAGC had us do a study of the WISC-4 on 339 children all over the United States. And what we found was that there were dramatic discrepancies between their highest score and their lowest score. And at that point, Dawn Flanagan and Ellen Kaufman, the two people who wrote the book Intelligent Testing with the WISC-4, said that if there is a 1.5 standard deviation discrepancy between the highest composite score and the lowest composite score, it rendered the full scale IQ score uninterpretable. That's been out since the WISC-4. If you see 23-point discrepancy between one composite score and another composite score, that's a 1.5 standard deviation discrepancy. The full scale IQ score is inaccurate. The test constructors and the test interpreters who've written the textbooks on how to interpret a Wechsler scale have made this abundantly clear since 2004. We're talking about 21 years that this information has been out there. A full-scale IQ score should not be used to deprive a child of gifted services. The top score in those cases is considered the best estimate of the child's abilities. When a child has a 141 visual spatial index, which is almost impossible to get because it's so heavily timed, that child is a gifted visual spatial learner who needs special services and needs to be taught to their visual spatial learning style. And if their verbal score was only 110, there are an awful lot of reasons why that might have happened. But for me, the first culprit to look at is, does this child have an auditory issue? Does this child have a central auditory processing disorder that is pulling down those scores? Or does this child have a speech and language issue that needs to be dealt with a speech pathologist? And that could have pulled down the score. Is this child bilingual or multilingual? And their vocabulary is not, because the verbal comprehension index is just similarities in vocabulary. Have they not developed vocabulary in the language in which this was administered? Yes. Are they not readers because they might have a vision issue? And in that, if they're not readers, they might have not developed the vocabulary needed to get a high enough score on the verbal. But that discrepancy between 141 and 110, that discrepancy is 2 standard deviations. That indicates that you have at least a twice exceptional child who's a gifted visual spatial learner, and the 141 is the best estimate of the child's abilities. That's not just my idea. That is in the books in which we interpret both the WISC-4 and the WISC-5.